Hello, let's keep going for another section of Thoughts on Colossus, the Rise of America's Empire book. This is chapter 6. And it begins with two epigraphs. One is from General F.S. Maude, The People of Mesopotamia, March 19th, 1917, which starts, "Our armies do not come to your cities and lands as conquerors or enemies, but as liberators." Then a second one, George W. Bush to the people of Iraq, April 4th, 2003. "The government in Iraq and the future of your country will soon belong to you. We will end a brutal regime so that Iraqis can live in security." And the book chapter starts, "Anyone who doubts that there are at least some resemblances between the liberal empire of the United States today and that of the United Kingdom roughly a century ago should consider the epigraphs to this chapter. The very rhetoric used by the British commander who occupied Baghdad in 1917 was unmistakably echoed by President Bush in his television address to the Iraqi people shortly after the American occupation of Baghdad began. In both cases, Anglophone troops have been able to sweep from the south of the country to the capital in a matter of weeks. In both cases, the government disclaimed any desire to rule Iraq directly and proceeded, after some provocation, to install Iraqi governments with at least the appearance of popular legitimacy. In both cases, imposing law and order proved much harder than achieving the initial military victory. Yet there are differences. One of these is the tension that has arisen between the United States and the United Nations over the future of Iraq. Britain did not have such difficulties after the First World War with the League of Nations. Nor is the only difference between the British and American experience in Iraq. British rule was based on a long-term commitment. Their intention was to stay in control of Iraq for the foreseeable future. Secondly, there were enough Britons willing to spend substantial portions of their lives in Baghdad to make British influence an enduring reality there for 40 years. The British and American occupiers both promised they would soon hand over powers to Iraqis and leave. The difference is that the Americans mean it. They sincerely want to go home. "Don't even go there" is one of the catchphrases heard on a daily basis in New York City. It sums up the problem exactly. Despite their country's vast wealth and lethal weaponry, Americans have little interest in the one basic activity without which a true empire cannot enduringly be established. They are reluctant to go there, and if they must go, then they count the days until they can come home. They eschew the periphery, they cling to the metropolis. The duration of an American occupation of Iraq remains, at the time of writing, clear in only one respect: it will be short. And to an extent, this is how it worked out. There is still an American presence in Iraq, and as far as I know, and there was certainly an American presence in Iraq for 2 decades after the invasion, as we know from stories of drone strikes and fights against ISIS and so on. But that does not mean that American troops controlled Iraq for those 20 years. This doesn't mean that it was a U.S. government in control for those 20 years. It doesn't mean that even though the Americans were there, that they controlled the entire system so substantially as to colonize Iraq. Today, Iraq is more or less functioning, as I understand it. There's skyscrapers in Baghdad and a few political troubles over the remains of ISIS or of a few warlords and tribes in the periphery of Iraq. But for the most part, it holds together. The recent wars and battles we've heard going on in Lebanon and Syria between Israel and Iran, we didn't hear a whole lot about Iraq. We didn't hear about Iraq dissolving into absolute chaos because of this issue. And this sort of encapsulates the wish of the American style of overseas adventures, I think. The Americans want to go in, beat somebody up, get out. You may stay, you may have a base or two, you may be involved in drone strikes, but for the most part, you're not spending trillions of dollars and putting hundreds of thousands of troops in a country for 2 decades, right? You also are not filling the very top of the political echelon in the country you're occupying with Americans and only Americans. You aren't, that is, America may be involved in the oil industry, may be involved in construction and so on, but for all that, the idea, at least, is that the Americans are going to spend as much money in the country as they take out of the country. That you aren't going to be sitting in the Congo, a la Belgium, and just ripping natural resources out of the ground. You aren't going to be in the Central African Republic and hiring warlords to smuggle gold out for you, a la Russia today. From a video I was watching earlier. So the Americans are there, but again, we have influence. We have American troops arriving and blowing things up and causing battles and IEDs and patrolling, but we also have an internal American debate over how long we're going to stay there. How much are we going to become involved? Right? The rhetoric, at least, that the American government tells to the American people is we're going there to liberate, and then we're going to get out. We're going there to liberate. We're going there to blow up whatever evil government they have, right? And then it'll be replaced with a democracy, and that democracy will just work. It turns out it doesn't just work. You have to spend a lot of time and effort to make it work, to make it efficient and successful. But we think we can do it. Unfortunately, it turns out, a la Afghanistan, you cannot force a democracy. You cannot force a government to stay in power. You can support it with massive numbers of troops and huge numbers of weapons and lots of money. Right? It's no mistake that Afghanistan falls as the Americans try to get the Afghanis to stand up, the Afghani government to stand up more by itself, and with less American support. Right? I mean, this is one of the bits of Afghanistan that's interesting, that the Karzai government was in control. It was legitimate, it had American support, and then it fell apart. You know, again, I'm not entirely clear on all the reasons for this besides just intertribal conflict. And if we go back to the idea of terrorism that we were talking about last time, especially in like Saudi Arabia, and what the US is supporting Saudi Arabia. So there's people who don't like the government of Saudi Arabia who decide to attack America because it's the great evil. And then you can unify people from all across the Middle East in order to attack America because America is everywhere in the Middle East propping up governments. And so you have terrorist attacks going on, but you also have a big target, soft target in the Americans because the Americans can't defend everything everywhere. But, you know, then how does America get out? That's sort of the question of American problems. If we go in, how do we get out? If we go in, how much support do we have to give? If we go in, do we end up having to prop up a government, spending $4 trillion in Afghanistan? Or can we do something else? The idea, at least with Japan and South Korea and Germany, is you go in, you stay for a long time, you pump up their economy, you make them great trading partners so that they get rich, and then the Americans trade with them and they both get rich and everybody's happy, kumbaya. You have a positive growth trajectory. But you can also look at a bit of history, right? Japan already had the capability of becoming a powerful, unified nation before the Americans ever got there. Germany had the capability of becoming a powerful, unified nation way before the Americans ever got there. Afghanistan, not so much. Iraq, it's a little more difficult. You look at Vietnam, and it did not, the Vietnamese, when the Americans arrived there and sort of took over the defense of the southern government from the French. Right? The idea was the same. You go in, you support the southern government, it's strong enough, and it's independent, and it's not communist, and eventually it takes over and we're friends, because communism is bad, and communism is weak, and the communists are going to fall apart. Anyway, it turns out that's not the case. There's a deep need in the American psyche, I think, to vilify your opponent. It might come from the history of the religion in America. Might come from the way that America tells its myths, right? For example, the United States, when it was heading westward, ended to kill and destroy a lot of Native American polities. And this must have been absolutely clear to the people on the ground what they were doing, but you can defend yourself by saying it's manifest destiny, or the natives are barbarians or something. Or, of course, like the Spanish missions in California, Spaniards arise and they go, well, we can use the Native Americans as slaves because we're actually converting them to Christianity and saving their souls. So it's all right? You tell little stories to yourself. The same with China and Taiwan, right? Well, Taiwan was part of China, so we should invade because they are the ones who are deciding to cause a beef with us, right? Or, well, some of the Chinese empires controlled Tibet, so we have a right to Tibet. And it's like, that's the story you tell, but how true is it? The 9-9 line in the South China Sea based on an old map from centuries ago. Like, well, everybody can claim a point. There's always a story someone can tell, but how true is it? And more importantly, what does telling that story do for you today? Right? The United States particularly is, and has been for quite a while, struggling with its own past. How should we regard slavery? How should we regard the Native Americans? How should we regard the Civil Rights Movement? How should we regard 9/11? How should we regard 2008? How should we regard, even just January 7th at the Capitol, right? Who are we? What is the story we tell? Who do we want to become? Who were we? Are we good or are we bad? Is it complicated? And how do we move forward? How do we take all these different voices and decide what to do? Who's actually in charge? How much does money and power matter? I'm not sure these questions are ever really answered or answerable. Like the story, I think one of the reasons that the American population soured on Afghanistan and Iraq is it went on for too long. We thought growing up, right, especially, you think, oh, okay, we're going in, we're attacking somebody, and we're helping prop them up, and then we're getting out. And then you hear, as you continue growing up, oh, more IEDs and more IEDs. And you meet a soldier with their legs blown off, and you meet someone who's lost a brother or a sister in battle, and then you meet someone else and someone else and someone else, and you see it on the news again and again and again. And you understand that this is troublesome, this is horrid, and this is war, and we got to stick through it. But then a decade passes, and you're still hearing about it. You're just tired. And it is unclear to the average American citizen why exactly we're there. Okay? Because if, again, we come back to the story that America tells itself. If America is an empire that controls and conquers these places, then obviously, hey, we go to Iraq, we take control, we get riches from it. Ta-da. But if the story America tells itself is we're going there and we're going to make it democratic and we're going to become friends with them because all democracies are friends, kumbaya, and that doesn't happen, then America has to deal with either the idea that it failed or with the idea that the story it's telling itself is not the true entire story. Right? And of course, there's always a tendency to vilify ourselves, to vilify the other person, to make extreme statements. And these extreme statements are very loud. It's what you hear. And then you walk along the streets of the city and you run into someone who has come from Afghanistan or Iran or Iraq. You go to school with people who are formerly from Ukraine or the Soviet Union. I remember I was when I was young, really young, I like applied for a year overseas in high school, and one of the questions they asked me was like, well, if the person you're staying with asked you not to be friends with a certain person because of their caste, how will you react? And I think I said I don't know. Right? I was like, I don't. Why would that happen? Because I know people here who are from India, and I don't see or notice this, but apparently it's a thing. And then I read an article once in a while that apparently it's a thing, even in the States, and I'm going, I don't understand really why this is something that happens. It's the same in any culture, any history. When you hear about it, you go, I don't understand why their way of life is different than mine. I don't understand why the story they tell themselves is different than the story I tell myself. Eventually, you get older and you learn how complicated people's lives are. You learn how complicated the truth can be. But you're always struggling to figure out what's going on and who people believe and how much it actually matters. Right. It continues talking about Britain, and Britain, they gave Lawrence's friend and wartime ally, the Hashemite Prince Faisal, the throne of the country. A plebiscite was duly held that endorsed Faisal's elevation. On August 23rd, he was crowned. Thus did the British create the country henceforth known as Iraq, which means ironically well-rooted country. And then there's oil there, and Faisal is not entirely a puppet, but he is a definite ally because the British props him up. And in short, they were British government representatives, military and civilian, in Baghdad uninterruptedly for almost exactly 40 years. When the British went into Iraq, they stayed. And here's a question. Will the Americans be playing such a role in Baghdad in 2043? It seems, to put it mildly, improbable. America invades Iraq in, 2003? Will it still be there in 2043? Very unlikely. The world changes faster today, it seems. The role that America will play in Iraq will not be the same. Yet we don't know that for certain. If we look at the history of the world, and the role America plays in Europe, for example, has remained mostly the same for the life of the Soviet Union and for 20 years after that. But now it's beginning to change a little as Europe returns back to understanding the need to fund its own defense, as Europe passes laws which are better for consumer protection, as Europe divorces itself from the United States economically by becoming closer to China, as Europe recognizes its need for strategic autonomy, as Europe passes laws over privacy or charging ports on iPhones that the US doesn't pass. We see differences here, right? There was this giant counterweight in the Soviet Union, and now that's not quite the case. And we can see that the way that the United States exists in the world is subtly changing, and it has subtly changed ever since then because there's a giant counterweight. Instead of struggling against the Soviet Union, you're just struggling against chaos. The book goes on to talk about Britain in other areas, other colonies, and it points out something that is very, very interesting, I think, to me. Between 1900 and 1914, around 2.6 million Britons left the UK for imperial destinations. 3/4 of them went to Canada or the Antipodes. Nevertheless, a significant number went to the much less hospitable climes of Asia and Africa. There were around 168,000 Britons in India in 1931. The official colonial service in Africa was staffed by more than 7,500 expatriates. The British went abroad in multiple roles: soldiers, administrators, businessmen, engineers, missionaries, doctors. The key point is that whichever role the British played, they generally stayed until retirement or, as countless colonial cemeteries testify, death. The substantial expatriate communities they established were crucial to the operation of the British Empire. Of crucial importance in this regard was the role of the Indian civil service. The proportion of Oxford and Cambridge graduates in the Indian civil service was high to over 70% in the 1880s. 2/3 of ICS men who served in 1930s had been educated in England's exclusive public schools. 3/4 had attended either Oxford or Cambridge. All but one of the 8 provincial governors in India in 1938 were Oxonians. Oxbridge products also staffed the less exalted colonial service, which administered the British colonies in Africa and other parts of Asia. Of the 927 recruits to the colonial service between 1927 and 1929, nearly half had been to Oxford or Cambridge. The key question is why so many products of Britain's top universities were willing to spend their entire working lives so far from the land of their birth, running in fairly hot, disease-ridden countries. Okay. Well, 2 things to look at here, and then we can compare and contrast it with the United States. 1, 168,000 Britons going to India. You have 1.5 million Britons going to Canada, right? So when Britain has a colony, what you're going to see is to certain of these colonies, lots of Britons traveling to the colonies as part of the colonial administration, right? As settlers in South Africa or Australia or Canada, as people who go there to live and grow and have children and die in India, right? Compare and contrast that with the Americans in Iraq. One of the continual problems that the American presence in the Middle East had is that there were terms of service. There were limits on how long you could remain deployed. So what happened quite often, as I understand it, is you would have a senior military person in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they would be there. They would have relationships with people. They would have trust build up. Right? They would have a system of how they worked. And then they'd be reassigned. And they'd be like, you've had 2 years in a combat area. We're bringing you back home and putting somebody else in your place, right? Because we don't want PTSD. We don't want a military person. I mean, we've looked at history, right? We don't want a military person to have a base of support in another country. Much better to take them out every 2 years, move them around, stop that, even the idea of that happening. Right? We want people to trust the American government, not this one person who happens to be an American. Right? You clamp down on opportunities for graft, for example, when you keep moving people around, so on and so on. But this means that you don't have a colonial administrator for Americans being there for 40 years. You simply do not have it. It does not exist. You may have a business going there. You may have some missionaries. You may have the Peace Corps. But you're not going to have an American person. You're not going to have an American viceroy, or not for very long at least. That viceroy is going to be replaced. America is going to decide to change its mind or its relation. I do wonder how much this is the case in the past, in like the Philippines, for example, or Puerto Rico. I think that might be interesting to look at. But the way I understand it in the present is the Americans don't have this administration. And as well, you don't have American colonists going. You may have a few hundred or a few thousand Americans traveling to Afghanistan and Iraq for their own purposes. It should be mercenaries or for charity reasons or for business reasons. But for the most part, the idea is you go to Iraq for a meeting, you stay there for a few months to work on some project, a dam, a road, a building, and then you leave. You go back to the United States. Right? Where are you going? If you're an American, where are you going to retire? You're not going to retire in Iraq. You're going to retire in the United States. You're going to retire in Portugal or something. Maybe you'll retire in Vietnam. You're not retiring in Iraq. Whereas if the British are involved, you have tens of thousands of Brits going there and now living there. And their loyalty is to the mother country. In America, you may have loyalty to America, but half the time your loyalty is actually just to the money you're making in the country. As well, it remarks this: you have the best, most well-connected, college-educated people going to the colonies in Britain. You graduate from Oxford to Cambridge, then you go to India to make your fortune. Then you come back. But lots of people stayed as well. Whereas in the United States, this isn't quite the case. The contrast with Americans today could scarcely be more stark. To put it bluntly, one of the most serious difficulties the U.S. currently faces is its chronic manpower deficit. There are simply not enough Americans out there to make nation-building work. More than 4/5, 82% of Americans on active military duty are based in the United States. Less than a third of Britain's total armed forces were stationed in the UK itself during its colonial period, right? Britain had its armies in the colonies to maintain order. The US has its armies in the US. And even, 50% of US foreign military personnel are in Japan or Germany. When you look at where does the U.S. send its forces, and it has bases, yes, it has bases everywhere. It has small, tiny bases everywhere. One of the reasons it can do this is it has space, it is air, it is the water, right? You don't need giant military bases anywhere when you can stuff everything you need on a couple of aircraft carriers and fly them in. When you can fill up a few ships with tanks and men and move 100,000 people from your home base to anywhere on the planet within 2 weeks. Right? When you have B-2 stealth bombers that can fly from the middle of Kansas to literally the other side of the world and bomb Iran, then go straight back home, you don't need a lot of foreign military bases that are very large. You just need them in case, right? You can enlarge them when you need to. You use them when you need to. You don't have big, juicy targets because those big, juicy targets are easily hit by missiles. Instead, you have lots of tiny bases and tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific. And you say to China, you know what, if you want to attack and assault 147 islands, go ahead. We're not going to have a big base for you to hit. We're going to have our main power in aircraft carrier, a fleet that goes around. We're not going to land massive troops on your shores. We're not going to invade Iraq without a lot of support. Right? So America doesn't have, in order to maintain its military security, America does not have to have its military bases large everywhere. A lot of instances where you look at, oh, America's a military base here, and you look at the numbers, it's like they got a few hundred or a few thousand folk there, and half their time is spent training the military of the place they're at, right? If you have Americans in Chad and Niger for a bit, what were they doing? There were a few hundred of them training the Chad and Nigerian and the Niger troops. They were working with intelligence and so on. They weren't walking around and patrolling the streets of the capital city, making sure there were no uppity colonists going around. Right? When American service personnel are posted abroad, they generally do not stay very long. Less a year, maybe a year and a half. It is worth remembering that more than half of America's 73 major overseas bases are in Western Europe, and 25 of them in Germany. Unlike the British, who built barracks in hostile territories precisely in order to subjugate them, the Americans today locate a quarter of their overseas troops in what is the most prosperous and arguably one of the most pacifist countries in the world. Then it makes this significantly when the Pentagon detects serious local hostility to one of its overseas outposts, as in the case of Subic Bay in the Philippines, the base is actually shut down. Right? So we look at the bombing of the embassy in Beirut. Right? Look, if the embassy in Beirut was a British colonial office, the British troops would have been there in their thousands within a few months. They would have found somebody to attack and kill and beat up, march through the streets, shown all those uppity colonists that you don't mess with the British Empire. And new viceroy, perhaps, maybe they would have left, maybe they would have stayed. But the British would have reacted very badly. What did the Americans do? We start bombing some random terrorists. We make protests, and we get the hell out. It doesn't always happen this way, but I think it's quite remarkable that a lot of American activity is due to the invitation by a host nation. Right? The government in charge may be a dictatorial government, may not be run very well, may be full of corruption, but there's somebody in the country inviting the Americans in. And that's how the Americans get in a lot of the time. Right? You notice there aren't a lot of American troops in Iran or China or Russia or Kazakhstan or South Africa. Why? They don't want them there. And this is a somewhat idealistic view. I'm sure, absolutely sure, there are American bases in countries that don't like us very much. We have Guantanamo Bay, for example. I'm absolutely sure that the Americans involve themselves in countries that we shouldn't be involving ourselves in. We don't have a whole legitimate claim where there's some rebel group we're supporting and not a powerful government. But I can also see the difference between European colonialism and the American hegemony. Right. Right. When Americans do, okay, so the problem of manpower is not purely military. Unlike the UK a century ago, the United States is an importer of people. Moreover, when Americans opt to reside abroad, they tend to stick to the developed world. There are an estimated 3.8 million Americans currently resident abroad. That sounds like a great many, but it is just 1/8 of the number of foreigners who live in the United States. And of the expatriate Americans, 3/4 live in Mexico and Canada or Europe. Of the 290,000 who live in the Middle East, 2/3 are found in Israel. A mere 37,500 live in Africa. This, in other words, is an empire without settlers. Or rather, the settlers come to the metropolis rather than leave it for distant lands. Right? So if America has a hegemony, it is an economic one, not a we own your lands one. It's more interesting, right? According to a 1998 survey, there are currently 134,000 registered Yale alumni. Of these, little more than 5% live out in the United States. 50 live in Arab countries. 50. 50 Yale graduates live in Arab countries. At Oxford and Cambridge 100 years ago, ambitious students dreamed of passing the ICS exam and embarking on careers as imperial proconsuls. Today, the elite products of the Ivy League set their sights in law school or business school. This, then, is not only an empire without settlers, but also an empire without administrators. Though he himself was an experienced diplomat whose past postings ranged from Afghanistan to Malawi, L. Paul Bremer and his staff are manifestly short of Middle Eastern expertise. It is a sobering statistic that just 3 of his initial team of officials were fluent in Arabic. It may be the bolder products of Harvard's Kennedy School are eager to advise the Iraqi Governing Council on its constitutional options. But we may be fairly certain that their engagement will take the form of a series of week-long trips rather than long-term residency. Consultancy, not colonization. As far as the Ivy League nation builders are concerned, you can set up an independent central bank, reform the tax code, liberalize prices, and prioritize the major utilities, and be home in time for your first-class reunion. It goes on. It can, of course, be argued that the American tendency to pay flying visits to the punitive imperium, rather than settle there, is just a function of technology. But there's only so much you can do over the phone if you're not living there. There's only so much influence you can have. There's only so much knowledge of what's going on in the country. There's only so much trust you can build with the powers in that country when it's all over the phone. So it's manifestly weaker than having British citizens actually there in charge. Talks about the CIA, and very few CIA operatives want to go live in Iraq or Afghanistan in a cave for 15 years. They would like a nice cushy job. They would like to work from a embassy somewhere. They would like to do neat little spy stuff with communists and Chinese and the Japanese and in Africa, right? They would like to go places and do fancy things. They don't want to sit in a cave growing trust with a terrorist organization for 15 years, trying to keep their whole mentality together. CIA doesn't like that. Right? You aren't simply ordering folk, and you can order soldiers around, but when you're the CIA and you're hoping to grab someone that can spend 5 or 10 years undercover somewhere, that is a very independent person. That is a person who is out on the far end of the support line. And is someone who is not going to follow orders all the time. Which means that how the Americans deal with their overseas issues is different. The Americans are going to tend to go to a economic action, like sanctions and so on, or they're going to go towards a military option, but it's going to be a short military option, like sending in special forces. Right? It is perhaps inherent in the nature of a democratic empire that should operate with a short time horizon. We keep electing new governments, and they keep changing their mind about how deeply they want to be involved. So any president on Earth, if he starts a war in Vietnam, knows that he can only really push for action in Vietnam for the 4 years of his term. He might lose the election, right? The person after him might not agree to do the same thing. He can only push for that long. So America is going to have this time scale it looks at. America is not going to act in, how do I put it, long-term views as the government in charge, right? As direct presidential action. Where America is going to act in a long-term view is in its businesses or in its governmental agencies, right? The bureaucrats who stay in for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years are the ones who are going to be pushing an option, pushing a view. They're always going to be struggling against the change in American policy up top. So you're going to see America be pretty unstable in its actions, I would say. Pretty unclear in exactly what it wants to do, except as regards its business, because the businesses are at least partially outside the government control. So what you should really be looking at, what is America going to do is, yeah, there's going to be some military intervention, but for the most part, it's going to be economic pressure, opening up trade, making sure that that there are rules to be followed, right? Making sure that that contracts are matched between a American business and a foreign business, right? America is not going to like nationalization of American sources, right? If you're nationalizing American oil, America is not going to like that. And how do you nationalize American oil? You nationalize an American oil company, right? That is, the Americans gave you the way the United States sees it, right? Is, look, we gave you a bunch of money, we invested in you. And if you want out of this contract, you got to pay us for that. So I think I think it'd be interesting to see, like, how would the United States react differently to a country that nationalizes a section of its oil, like an oil company with American investors. And do they nationalize it as in take it and steal it and declare it's part of the nation now, like part of Colombia or whatever? Or do they nationalize it as in, we're going to forcibly buy your stock at market prices now. We're forcing you to sell. I'm not sure. So I've heard that, when they nationalized this company or that company, nationalized the rail service. And I'm like, I don't really exactly understand how that works. And they go into debt, they buy it. I think that's something to ask and look at. And the book starts talking here about what does this mean for the American effect on the world. Okay. President Bush is fond of citing Japan and West Germany in 1945 as examples of what successful American intervention can achieve. This overlooks the awkward fact that the formal occupation regimes lasted 7 years in the Japanese case and 10 in the West German, and that even to this day, the deployments of American troops in those two countries remain among the largest anywhere in the world. It is also worth remembering a third success story, South Korea, which took until the late 1980s to become a genuine democracy after nearly 40 years of American military presence. I think it's also important to notice that America helped these countries achieve their own self-sufficiency, their own working democracy and wealth, in the face of an outside pressure of the Soviet Union. Today, that pressure has mostly disappeared. Well, that pressure at least is smaller and weaker. Russia, for example, may push Japan, right? May say we want to take territory, but Russia is not in the job of taking over entirely the Japanese government and turning it communist. Russia wants its peace. Russia wants to be an empire. It's not the Soviet Union anymore, not this ideological force that seeks to overthrow and destroy all those who disagree with it. Instead, it would just like to beat them upside the head and steal their gold. Okay, talks, by contrast, relatively little good and probably a good deal of ill came with the numerous short-term American interventions in Central America and the Caribbean, which began in 1898. Unfortunately, the time frames contemplated for Iraq and Afghanistan are closer to these dismal episodes in the post-1945 success stories. Baghdad simply cannot be turned into a capital of Western-style democracy in the space of a year. Many Iraqis expected the Americans to stay longer than the Americans themselves were planning to. Now, the United States, I think, recognized this. The book will go on and basically saying that the government of the United States looked at what happened in Vietnam, looked at what happened with all these interventions in the Caribbean countries, and said, what we actually need to do this time is stay. We need to go into Afghanistan and stay. We need to go into Iraq and stay there. We have to support these countries for decades, perhaps, in order to turn them around. They end up fighting against the American populace, I think. Right? The government can say all at once, the bureaucrats in the State Department or the 35-year careerist in the military can say, look, we need to stay in Iraq for another 15 years. And it makes perfect sense. And they're probably right if we want to change how Iraq works as a country. But internal American politics are saying we're spending a bunch of money and losing a bunch of our people. That people are dying. Our soldiers are dying in Iraq, and we don't have to be there. We could leave. Why are we there? Well, the answer is we're there because it'll be good in 15 years. Americans aren't really great at that. Like as I know, just walking the streets and talking to people about like their investments in their 401ks, large numbers of people in the United States simply do not have the mentality of, okay, so if I save like this for 25 years, then I'll be a millionaire when I retire. It's not their time frame, right? I'm going to save a bit of money and we'll see what happens, right? Or I can save up for something in 6 months. I can save up for a car. I can save up for a house, maybe, right? But until you have, that goes to part of the rising rates of rentership in the United States as opposed to ownership, right? Once you own a house that has a 30-year mortgage, then you're more inclined to think in these terms of we've got to stay here for 30 years. And it's going to be costly, but it's going to be good at the end. You're more inclined to think in these generational terms, 2 3 generations down the line. I want to ensure like grandkids have a house to live in. But America is changing. You have income disparity levels rising and more renters. More people who don't have that hope for a house. More people who think that they need to make it and then they're not making it. And then you lose hope and you have all these internal troubles. You have rising rates of drug addiction, for example. You have more political turmoil. You have less stability in the United States. And this affects the internal politics, which affects how America acts overseas. There's always been this tendency in the United States towards isolationism, which is, I think, unfortunately growing at this time. And we did manage to stay in Afghanistan for a long time and Iraq for a long time, in a way. But today, I'm not sure if the government suggested we invade Iran or something, that the United States population would be willing to say, okay, well, we invade Iran and it's a country of like, I don't know, 30, 100 million people, something like that, 98 million. So we got to have, 4 million American troops in the country to control it. And the United States average voter does not want to do that. They want to go in, they want to pound sand, blow up a few nuclear enrichment sites and get out, right? They don't want to, America does not want to stay and take over and be a colonial empire. It just wants to have safety, right? It wants to have the sense that, look, Vietnam is not going to attack the United States anytime soon. Whereas North Korea keeps threatening to send missiles and keeps firing missiles over Japan, right? So, of course, the United States wants to overthrow the government of North Korea. But that doesn't mean that, for example, the United States wants to overthrow the government of Thailand or India. They just wish them to act a little differently, and that's the way it goes. That's politics. We're trying to change how countries act separately, right? The United States doesn't want to overthrow the Philippines. It just wants the Philippines to not be allied militarily with anyone but the United States. The U.S. reaction toward China, I think, is a little more complicated because China isn't as quite overtly hostile as Russia is, for example. There's the in 2004, there was still this sense that the United States and China could work together. It's becoming less likely, is the feeling today. Then it goes on about the British activities in Egypt, in the Suez, and over the Suez Canal, compares and contrasts with America, with the Americas. Basically, the UK was in Egypt for a very long time, but it was sort of a shadow government, and it promised to leave but never did. Whereas the United States is like, I guess that's perhaps the question you should ask as a member of a country that the United States has chosen to invade. Right? Do you think that when the Americans say to the Iraqis, we want to leave, we want to give you democracy, and then we'll get out of here. We'll leave a few troops, we'll give you some money, right? But just calm down. Like, does the average Iraqi actually believe that? I'm certain that if the British invade Iraq in 1913, the average Iraqi thinks the British will be there for a very long time. I'm not sure about the United States. Not sure about the view of other people in other countries upon the United States. We often in the United States think that other countries dislike us and vilify us. But I've been to plenty of other countries, and I have mostly encountered the opposite. People want the United States to be that shining city on a hill. We just fail at it a little too often. And basically what this book is saying is that if the United States is going to involve itself in overseas adventures, then it ought to do it in the right way. It ought to go, if it's going to overthrow a country, then don't just send in some special forces and blow it up. Don't, I don't know, attack Venezuela and destroy their army and navy, their presidential palace, and establish democracy, then leave. No. Understand that if you go in and you destabilize a country, or you destabilize it further, or you take advantage of this country's already destabilized state, then that what is going to result is just chaos and war and trouble. It's not going to be calm for a very long time. You could toss a stone into the water and all the fish came leaping out like there were piranhas and tyrants and bugs trying to escape. And it's you thought it was just a lake with clear water, but it is filled with predators and destruction. So instead, what you have to do, if you're going to intervene the correct way, the United States. Go in and say, we're going to be here for 20 years. Go in and say, we will support you all the way. Go in and say, we will build you roads and houses and hospitals, and we will train you and teach you. Don't just think, well, we can put the Shah of Iran in charge and he'll make it all better. No. You didn't solve the underlying problem. You didn't solve the issue that that the United States was even capable of doing that. Ideally, no country should be so weak as to be such that the United States can overthrow it with a few dozen people, right? There's no country that should be so weak that the United States can destroy it within a few days. There's no country that could be so weak that recognizes that it is militarily weak, a la Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and yet also obstinate and stupid enough to continue fighting. Right? I think that it's one thing that the Americans people of the United States need to work on. Right? Is the U.S. talks a big talk. Right? We're always condemning people, and other places are always condemning the U.S. for its actions. But if you aren't willing to back it up with actual decisions, the hard decisions of changing the way you act or changing the way you interact with the United States or other countries, then nothing actually changes. And we get closer and closer to the brink of destruction, brink of that disturbed water, instead of recognizing that we need to grow something in the water, right? You can have, like, okay, put some water on the ground. One of three things happens to it. One, the water dissipates, and everything was living in it dies. It's a dry mud hole with fish gasping for air. Two, it is a flat plane of water. Mosquitoes plant their eggs in it, and they are a scourge upon the neighborhood. Or three, a seed lands in the water, and it grows. And one day, where once there was just a hole, now you have an ecosystem. Now you have a tree growing. And what the United States, if it's going to involve itself in these countries, if it's going to pour, gasoline on the fire, if it's going to flood an area with troops and money and goodwill, then make sure you end up with a tree afterwards. You make sure you make that seed grow and give it and protect it and push for it, and not just sit back, splash everything around in the mud, watching the fish die and the mosquitoes thrive. Okay. And next time, be chapter 7, 8 in the conclusion. I think I can finish it all next time. But for now, I'll let it go. Really, we're going to start asking, what does the United States require to do what I said it should do? What is the world going to look at? Because this book is written in 2004, right? Yeah, in 2004. So it is suggesting a world will end up turning a certain way. It doesn't get all of it right, and I think it's quite interesting to look at, because we can compare and contrast what happened then to what happens now, right? What was the result of the action? We did end up, as the United States, actually staying in Afghanistan and Iraq for quite a long period of time, just as this book suggests we do. Afghanistan was a failure. Iraq was at least a partial success. And we are again entering an era where the future of the world, political powers, is unclear. It doesn't seem as if the EU is going to rise up to become the great power. China seems to be doing it instead. The United States is falling behind and experiencing its own internal political issues again. The EU is not entirely sure about which way it should dedicate its activities. Africa is half scattered, half drawn to Russian anti-democratic support, and half just trying to hold itself together. South America is filled with half the countries are fine and growing and socialist leaning. The other half are ruled by dictators or experiencing turmoil or have drug problems or are in massive debt. You look at Southeast Asia and it seems to be booming again, or at least doing quite well, but it's stuck between understanding how it should move forward, right? Like, what should India be? What does India want to be as a country? You have a rising religious issues there. Pakistan is always on the verge of falling apart. How is Iran going to act in the future? The Gulf states are attempting to move their economies away from oil, will that be successful? You know, it's something to ponder, really. And ponder we shall next time when we read, and I hopefully don't yell too much, as it will end up talking about the deficit again, and the open door between America and China, and, common issues which, as someone who, again, is ideal and philosophical and steeped in, old Confucian Mencius ways of looking at the world, as well as the modern American ideals, my inner self wants to say, why can't we just all get along? But then I look at my own country, the United States today, and I realize, oh, why am I talking about the rest of the world getting along when my own country is ready to start brawling among itself, right? It's easy, I think, to read books like this, written in 2004, written after the fall of the Soviet Union, written when the United States is on its foreign adventures, very powerful, center of the world, and to think that the world will always be like that, to think that we are able to recognize and fix our problems. But then you turn on the news and you hear some political issue that I recognize from reading about the ancient Roman Republic, and you realize it never really gets better. You never really become absolutely clear on who we are and what we want as a person, as a nation, as a continent, as a species. We're still figuring it out.